Okay, we've made it to week 5 of photography, and this week we are going to dive deep into some technical aspects of photography. And that can be both fun and a little bit daunting if you've never covered this stuff before. But it is learnable, so give yourself some grace and keep trying things to figure it out. The more you practice, the more you'll figure it out. So we're going to learn about manual controls this week and specifically about aperture and shutter speed. So using manual controls is all about creating exposure and creating a good exposure. But the fun thing with manual controls is you get to control all the aspects of how the camera is taking the photo. So literally how the mechanism is working inside your camera. You're controlling that. There are three main things that you can adjust in your camera that all work together to create exposure. So one of these is called aperture. We'll talk about that. Shutters. The other thing is called shutter speed. And then last week we talked about ISO, which is the sensitivity of your sensor. So if you look at that little triangle in the bottom right, they're all connected together to get the right exposure. So if you adjust one, then you need to adjust the others to balance exposure. So for example, if I make my aperture brighter, I need to make either my ISO or my shutter speed or both of them a little bit darker in order to get a good exposure. And conversely, let's say I make my shutter speed darker, then I need to make either my ISO or my aperture brighter to get a good exposure. So it's a balance of all these things. And to make it even trickier, each of these things is not just adjusting the exposure, but they all affect the style of your photo as well. So there's two things that each of these changes in your photograph when you change the setting. Let's start with aperture. What is aperture? Aperture literally refers to an opening inside your lens that you can make bigger or smaller. So you can have a big opening, you can have a small opening. So if you stop to think about it, for exposure, a bigger opening means more light is getting in, so a brighter exposure. A smaller opening means less light is getting in, so a darker exposure. But when we talk about style, aperture also affects the depth of field. So the depth of field is essentially just kind of the deep space that you're photographing into, how much space there is. And the depth of field is how much of that space, of that field, so to speak, is in focus. So you can see in the two photos on the bottom, one of them has a very short depth of field, or we call it shallow depth of field, and one of them has a deep depth of field. So let's look at each of these, in succession. So a shallow depth of field means that part of your space or field is blurred out. Often, this is the background, but it's not necessarily the case. So in this picture, the photographer could have, you can just vaguely see there's another flower in the background. The photographer could have set the focus on that flower in the background, and the flower in the foreground would then be blurred out. So aperture really just, a shallow depth of field just means the amount. There's a small amount that is in focus and the rest is out of focus. But where you set that focus is up to you. So it's tricky. What does this do to your style? So I like to say that this creates isolation and emphasis, right? We are drawing attention to this one flower bud and we are ignoring the rest of the flowers and whatever else is behind this flower. So by blurring out everything else, we're saying this is the most important thing. We're isolating it and we're saying we're emphasizing it. So again, with a shallow depth of field, that means that you have a large opening. So it's a little bit tricky. A large opening means that you have a small depth of field. So there's a little kind of inverse relationship there. So you can see in that picture on the bottom, that's literally a picture of what an aperture might look like with a big opening. It's almost as big as the lens itself. So what happens is, if you're interested in physics, the light rays enter, and because it's such a big opening, they have a strong angle. They're not horizontal. They're coming in at an angle, so it means they're hitting the sensor in a different way, and that's what creates the blurriness. To make it even more confusing, a large opening is referred to by a small, it's called an f-stop number. So sometimes you'll see f/4. So that's the measurement of the opening, and that's actually a larger-ish opening, which creates a shallow depth of field. Sometimes it's just easiest to connect a small number means a small depth of field, a large number means a large depth of field. So you can ignore the fact that the size of the opening is actually different. If you've got a kit lens, your aperture may not go below 4, which you can get some of a shallow depth of field, but sometimes we talked about how you might need a macro lens to do macro photography. So sometimes you need a fancier lens to get that really big opening in order to get that really big shallow depth of field. The opposite of a shallow depth of field is a large depth of field. So in this picture of the horse, if the plane were blurred out, it would just be this blob in the background and it wouldn't make any sense. But because we get this kind of old decaying plane, and then you can also see the palm trees, it really tells the story going on. And so everything, even though we lose some detail just naturally as things recede into the background, but they are in focus so we can see what's going on. So the style of this, I like to call this inclusion, or sometimes I've heard some people refer to it as storytelling. It is different than staging a story or photojournalism, but it's storytelling in the sense that like the setting is in focus and the other props are in focus. We're not blurring things out. We're including everything in the photo because it's an important part of the photo. So this happens because so you can see that's a very narrow opening in that other picture of what the aperture looks like with a small aperture. Those little blades all kind of come in and create a smaller opening. And what it does is it narrows the light rays, and that's why you get a longer, a more deep focus. However, what this does to the exposure is that it lets in a lot less light. So you have to then balance with the other ISO or shutter speed. And again, even though it's a small opening, the f-stop number is actually a bigger number. So sometimes you'll see numbers like f/18, f/22. Often it can go up to 32, but that's so small that you often don't really want to use that big of, well, rather should I say that small of an opening. But again, if it's easier to think of, that big number means big depth of field, means everything's in focus. So that, very briefly, is aperture. Shutter speed. Shutter speed refers to a different mechanism. So the aperture and the shutter are two different mechanisms, both inside your lens and camera body. And the shutter opens and shuts, so how quickly it opens and stays open and then shuts again. And the shutter reveals the sensor, which then absorbs the light. So if the shutter is open slower, it's letting in more light, so you get a brighter exposure. If the shutter is opening faster, open shut, it lets in less light and you get a darker exposure. For style, shutter speed affects the appearance of motion, whether it's blurry or crisp. So you can see the picture on the left will have a high shutter speed. The picture on the right has a slow shutter speed, and you get different kinds of motion that way. So let's look at these individually. So with a fast shutter speed, I like to call this style freezing motion. Right? You are freezing the moment perfectly with perfect clarity because you get a really fast shutter speed. However, if you remember, if it opens quickly, we get less light for our exposure. So exposure is usually measured in fractions of a second. So a fast shutter speed could be anywhere from 1/250th of a second to 1/1000th of a second. That's really fast. Um, you can get slower and faster. These ranges that I'm giving you are just like common ranges to help you sort of identify, like, what am I seeing? What do these numbers mean that I'm seeing? So when you see that second, that means shutter speed. Sometimes your camera won't show you that fraction. It'll just show you 250 or 1000. But that bigger number always means shutter speed, and it means it's the fraction of the second. So if you are wanting to take a picture of motion, of something in motion, and you're trying to emphasize that motion, and you want to freeze the motion, what your picture needs what I call a defying gravity moment. So in this picture on the left, right, we know they're defying gravity. Those two women who are swimming cannot stay like that, right? They're going to fall into the water. This kind of swoop of the water that's coming off of their heads and hair is also going to then fall into the water. So we know this is like a clear moment of time where before they were coming out of the water, afterwards they're going to go back in the water. So there's defying gravity. I can take a freezing motion picture, but if I take it of someone sitting, it doesn't really look like I'm freezing motion. Or even sometimes if I take a picture of someone walking, if it looks like they're stable, sometimes it just feels like they're standing there. So if you're actually trying to show motion in your picture, you need that defying gravity moment. However, sometimes using shutter speed is nice because things are moving around and you're not necessarily trying to show motion, but you don't want blur. So that's when you want to think about freezing motion too. So again, it depends on the goal of your photograph. Sometimes it can be nice to blur motion. This is a little bit trickier, but it can be a really fun way to show that things are in motion. Also, when you're blurring motion, you're using a slower shutter speed, and that lets in more light. So in a low light scenario, and this is why, if you've ever been in a low light scenario and all of your photographs are blurring, it's because your camera is using a slower shutter speed to let in more light. So that's what's happening. If you're looking at your settings, so 1/5 of a second to 1/30th of a second, these aren't long exposure photographs, but they're slower shutter speeds, and that's when you'll get your motion blur. And it's tricky because if you actually think how quick a second is, 1/30th of a second is still quite quick, but it's long enough to capture some motion blur. If you are intentionally taking a motion blur photo, one thing that you need to do to make sure your photo doesn't just feel blurry is to make sure that part of your photo is in focus. So if you've ever seen a picture of a waterfall and the water is blurring and it's beautiful and blurry and you can see the motion, often like the rocks and the nature around the waterfall will be in focus. And this just gives our eyes something to actually focus on, so that it doesn't just feel like a giant blur. When everything is blurry, you don't really want to look at something because you want to be able to focus on something. So this picture down here of these motorcyclers, you can see there's a group of 4 in the middle that are either moving slowly, not moving at all, and everyone else is zooming around them. And it's that contrast that makes the picture interesting. But if they weren't in focus, it would just feel disifying and kind of not nice to look at. More than likely, most photos that you see that part of it is in motion blur and part of it is in focus, they're using a technique called panning, which is really hard to do, but can create some really interesting photos. And panning just means that you are following something that is moving smoothly with your camera, and then you take the picture as you follow the motion of that picture. So if a bicycle is moving past you, you actually are tracking the motion of the bicycle. You're moving your camera with the bicycle, and then you take that picture. And because you move your camera with the bicycle actually looks like it's still, and the background looks like it's moving. So with this picture, we get a little bit of both. You can see, if you look at the sidewalk in the background, you can see that it looks a little bit blurry too. So my guess is that this photographer was panning this group of 4 that were also moving slower or not moving at all. And then everyone else is zooming around them. So you get kind of that extra sense of motion blur, which is nice. The third thing that matters with manual controls and exposure is ISO. So we talked about ISO last week, but just a little refresh. ISO refers to the digital sensor on your camera and how sensitive it is to light. So if you have a low ISO, like 100 or 200, it means the camera is essentially capturing less light, but it doesn't matter if you have enough external light, but it creates that smooth texture. If you have a low light scenario, it means your camera is capturing more light. It's more sensitive to light, which is nice if you don't have as much external light, but then it can also create that grainier texture, which we don't want. So with this picture down here, it's probably a combination of a slower shutter speed with a tripod and since nothing is moving, then that slower shutter speed can capture more light, but then also a higher ISO to also capture that light. Okay, so how do you put it all together? If you look at the camera, the mode dial on your camera, you'll see that I've been talking about using that P setting. Above that P setting, often you'll see what's called semi-automatic settings. So if you have a Nikon, it'll look like A or S. A stands for aperture, S stands for shutter speed. If you have a Canon, it can look like AV and TV. I have no idea where TV comes from, but again, basically those are called priority settings, so aperture priority or shutter speed priority, and it means that you as the photographer get to set the aperture or the shutter speed, but then the camera sets everything else. So you don't have to worry as much about exposure, and it can be nice if you're trying to take a quicker picture to use those settings. If you've never used manual settings before, I recommend using those settings to start out with, especially for the ALA this week. But if you want to use manual settings, how do you even know where to start, what to do? So the first thing you need to do is figure out what kind of style of photograph do you want. Do you want a photograph that controls shutter speed or a photograph that controls depth of field? A photograph that controls motion or a photograph that controls depth of field? And for each one, which end of the spectrum do you want? Do you want a photograph that shows motion, that blurs motion, or freezes motion? Do you want a photograph that has a shallow depth of field or a large depth of field? So you're going to pick that style and you're going to set that control first. So for example, if you want a shallow depth of field, you're going to choose a low f-stop number. Or if you want to freeze motion, you're going to choose a fast shutter speed. And then you're going to look at the exposure meter on your camera and you're going to adjust the opposite to balance the exposure and create a good exposure. So for example, if I'm choosing a fast shutter speed because I want to freeze motion, that means I have less exposure coming in, right? Fast shutter speed means less light. So I need to adjust aperture to let in more light. So I'm going to have a lower f-stop number because that's a bigger opening. I'll just keep adjusting that f-stop number until I see that exposure meter start to balance around 0. Now let's say that I have such a fast shutter speed that I can't balance my aperture enough, or I start to blur out the background more than I want to blur out the background. That's when I can use ISO to boost the exposure. So always start with a low ISO, And then only increase the ISO if you can't create the balance that you need with aperture or shutter speed. But always start with aperture and shutter speed and then use ISO as a third thing to balance. And then after you take the picture, look at your picture. So first off, is the exposure what you want it to be? And then secondly, did you get the style that you wanted? So is the exposure good? Did you freeze the motion? And then are there any unintended stylistic traits that you actually want to adjust? So for example, when you freeze motion, you often get a shallow depth of field. Do you want that shallow depth of field? And if not, go back in, adjust things, and fix them. So that is manual settings. It takes a while to figure out, but it gives you ultimately the most control over the photographs that you are taking. There is a video that I want you to watch. He demonstrates like how you would actually go about adjusting all of those things with a pool table and some toys and a fan, and it's a really good video. So please watch that video because that'll show essentially like what I'm talking about in this slideshow and how to actually adjust that on your camera. So for this week's ALA, I want you to experiment with shutter speed and aperture. So I want you to do one aperture picture where you find a quote unquote deep scenario. It could just mean like my lighting tutorial last week that it's just stages of toys, or you can like go find a landscape, but you're gonna want something that's like a subject you can focus on, then with area behind it. And then I want you to play with aperture. So can you use a shallow depth of field and focus on something close to you and blur out the background? Can you use a large depth of field where you take the whole scenario in crisp focus? And then I also want you to do one shutter speed picture. So find something in motion, experiment with using different shutter speeds to capture that motion. So can you freeze the motion? Can you blur the motion? And then don't forget, if you're freezing motion, you need that. So the goal of this picture is to show the motion. So you need that defying gravity moment for freezing motion, and you need that moment of clarity for blurring motion. When you're doing that slow shutter speed, I really recommend using a tripod. Otherwise, you're going to get some camera shake. And then again, unless you're familiar with manual settings, I really recommend using those semi-automatic settings, those priority settings for aperture and shutter speed, because that'll just help you get started a little bit easier. And then you can transition, when you're comfortable with those settings, you can transition into manual settings later on. But let's look at some inspiration. So we've seen a couple of the sports photos. So that water, the synchronized swimming photo, and the soccer photo right at the beginning were all taken by this photographer, Dave Black. And he does these amazing staged photographs of sports and athletes. So often he'll bring studio lights into the whatever arena or place that he's doing. So he gets this really dramatic lighting, and then he also gets really dramatic angles. He gets down low, he gets up high, and then he always captures that defying gravity moment so that you can see that things are in motion. So I love this photo because you got these dynamic curved lines going through, and the shadow that goes across those lines and fills the space so interesting. And even from above, you can tell this person is in motion because she's above the ground. Her shadow is not meeting her feet. So you know both feet are off the ground and she is moving fast. So Dave Black, he does a lot of staging, but then he also does kind of normal sports photography. And if you look at this, just the drama of the moment, how the one player is sliding in to touch the base, the other player is catching the ball. They're both about equidistant away from the base. So you kind of don't know. There's like this drama of like who is going to touch it first. But then again, like you get that motion, right? They're both in the air. The dust is moving. You get the expression of the umpire. And then it fills it dynamically sort of fills that space really, really well. And all of that, so everything he takes is with a fast shutter speed. For aperture inspiration, and usually using a shallow aperture, is an artist called Tanaka Tatsuya. He everything a lot of what he does is called miniature calendar, because he takes a photo a day, which is just amazing. But he uses everyday objects, and then 3D prints tiny, tiny things to fit into those everyday objects to turn them into something else. So here we have a notebook, and the spiral of the notebook becomes a bike rack. And it's just fun. It's quirky. I love the humor. But then also, even though this is a very, very small amount of space, he's using aperture to emphasize the man with his miniature motorbike. So we're drawn to the area that's the most important of the photograph. And it also kind of creates this illusion that the space is really deeper than it is, because you get that blur, you get that feeling of like, yeah, it's going off into the distance. Here's another example where he's focusing on the skier going down the lovely piece of cake. And you get the audience in the foreground is blurred out, and then the like mountains of whipped cream in the background are blurred out. So again, it's emphasizing what needs to be emphasized and sort of creating the illusion of space. Not all of his photographs have a shallow depth of field. Again, it kind of depends on what he decides that the photograph needs, to kind of what needs emphasis and if it all needs emphasis. So he's adjusting accordingly to the needs of the photograph, but often he uses the shallow depth of field. And again, it's just fun. That giant raspberry on the side kind of just adds to the silliness of everything and makes it fun. All right, have a lot of fun this week. It is a technical week, but do continue to think about what makes a good photograph a good photograph. How are you using composition and lighting, getting that good exposure, getting the focus perfect, creating blur where you want blur, and creating focus where you want focus. So go forth and photograph.